Good morning and welcome to the 19th meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Our first item today is to decide whether the consideration of a draft report on the pre-budget scrutiny for 2021-22 should be taken in private at future meetings. Are members agreed? Seeing no indication that there's disagreement in the chat bar, we now therefore go to item 2, which we'll now hear from Mike Russell, who is the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, on the UK withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill at stage 1. Welcome the Cabinet Secretary to the meeting and his supporting officials, Emma Lipinska, who is the Constitutional Policy Manager, Charles Stewart Roper, who is the Head of Environmental Strategy, and Francesca Morton, who is a solicitor in the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, can I invite you to make a brief opening statement, please?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm just, waiting for the camera to come on, which is not coming on at the moment.
No, I'll just give it a couple of seconds, Cabinet Secretary.
There we are. Sorry about that, convener. Something obviously in glitch in the mix. Thank you for the invitation to give evidence here today. If I can, as you suggest, give a brief opening statement, and of course I'll be very happy to answer the committee's questions. These are perilous days, weeks and months for the future prosperity of Scotland and indeed for the rest of these islands. The 8th round of negotiations between the UK and the EU takes place this week, with very significant issues still outstanding. We are apparently hurtling towards the cliff edge of a no deal or a very poor low deal by the end of this year, because the UK government has refused to seek an extension to the transition period. And in the middle of all this, a bill on the UK internal market will be published today, which will ride roughshod over the competence of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, and will also severely damage the withdrawal agreement. In this context, I believe it's vital we take action now so that we can protect the interests of the people, businesses and the environment of Scotland, and this bill is crucial to that task. It's critical in ensuring that there continue to be guiding principles on the environment in Scotland, and it will establish an environmental governance body to secure full and effective implementation of environmental law. It is critical also that it gives us the legislative tools we need to maintain some stability and consistency in our laws after the powers in the European Communities Act are lost. It's critical also to ensure that Scotland is able, where it makes sense to do so, to continue to align with EU law in the future, as indeed the people of Scotland expressed was their preference in the 2016 referendum. We've waited for over 4 years for clarity, and we can't wait any longer. It is for this Parliament to decide, for Scotland, how to legislate for these matters, and that is what the bill aims to do. Camilla, let me briefly address some of the issues which I know have arisen during the course of the evidence you've taken. It's become clear to me that there are a couple of misunderstandings that I should clear up, and let me therefore clearly set out what the bill provides for. In recognition of the unique circumstances in which this bill is brought before Parliament, the power will expire after 10 years. The length of the sunset period is an attempt to provide stability, to avoid the potential need for numerous and different bills, to allow time for us to assess the impact of Brexit, and I'm sure, if I might say so, it will take us comfortably, very comfortably, through the period of accession for an independent Scotland to the EU. For the purposes of clarity, I would also ask the committee to note that whilst the power at section 1.1 will at some time expire, section 3.3 makes clear that any regulations made under the power do not expire. Whilst Rosanna Cunningham is leading on part 2 of the bill, I'd also like to take the opportunity to clarify the scope of section 10.2. This duty requires UK ministers to have regard to the guiding principles on the environment when developing policies so far as extending to Scotland. This duty applies to all policy developed by UK ministers, subject to the limited exceptions set out in the bill which extend to Scotland. Comparisons have also been made between section 17 of the previous continuity bill and section 10.2 of this bill, but section 10.2 is a very different provision. Lastly, I want to make clear that the Scottish Government's intention is to work with the Parliament to agree an appropriate and proportionate decision-making framework for future alignment with EU law. We all agree, I'm sure, that decision-making around the issues of which we might wish to align with EU law will vary, depending on the specific measures being considered. As I said to the Environment Committee last week, the Scottish Government does not have all the answers. That's why working with the Parliament and others is so important. Now, I agree with those who have said that the broad nature of EU law and the different scenarios we might face makes agreeing such a framework on the face of the bill not only unhelpful, but actually very difficult indeed. But I am more than happy to commit to liaising with the Parliament to allow the Scottish Government to consider how an appropriate level of consultation with the Parliament and stakeholders at the earliest stage of policy development can be ensured and indeed built in. I want also to say to the committee that the Scottish Government is not ruling out the use of primary legislation where that would be the best and most appropriate legislative route, but it shouldn't be the default or the only route. Let me finally take the opportunity to remind the committee that in the Scottish Government's view, the power at Section 1.1, the core power, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, is a pragmatic, practical, proportionate power, which is both discretionary and time limited, and it will be subject to full parliamentary scrutiny. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. One of the real challenges which the committee and the Parliament face in considering the bill is obviously the ongoing uncertainty regarding the constitutional impact of Brexit on devolution. In particular, the future relationship with the EU still remains unclear, common frameworks are still to be agreed, and now we have the possibility of the Internal Market Bill. Now, I know you've touched on this already, but given the level of uncertainty, can you give us a bit more detail about why you introduced the bill at this time with all of that mix of uncertainty that it currently exists?
Well, this bill has been delayed by the COVID pandemic. We really should have been considering this bill in the spring to early summer of this year, but that was not possible to do after the lockdown took place on the 23rd of March. And therefore the bill's progress was delayed by the pandemic. So this is later than I would have wished, but it's still vital that we have the tools available to us. We should also not allow the agenda on this to be dominated or set by the UK Tory government. Today is a significant day in terms of the publication of the Internal Market Bill. And in case anybody is tempted during this session to attack me in any way, because we are objecting to that, I would draw their attention to the statement from the Welsh Labour government last night, which I think, if anything, is in stronger language than any I have used. This is a major threat to devolution, and it's a major destabilising force. For a government, the UK government that seeks stability, all it does is create instability, as it's continuing to do by its failure to come to a negotiated agreement with the EU. So what I'm trying to do is to ensure that we have the powers which we believe we need, the minimum powers that we need, to do some of the things to preserve European regulation, which the Parliament has already agreed we should do, because a variant of these powers existed in the original Continuity Bill and indeed survived unscathed but from the challenge from the UK government in the Supreme Court. I would really wish that the current UK government would see sense. I had another conversation yesterday with Michael Gove and Alex Sharma about this bill, about their bill. I mean, I really wish they would see sense, accept that the frameworks are the right way to go forward, a voluntary way to go forward. I've given my own assurances about those frameworks and how they would operate. And indeed, if there is anything missing in that programme, as Michael Gove keeps claiming, though he doesn't say what, then we will plug that gap. We should not be having the Internal Market Bill. And the Internal Market Bill, of course, has been made even worse by an admission by a UK government cabinet member of its illegality under international law. It is almost beyond belief that we're in that position.
Cabinet Secretary, the two questions I'm going to ask have been very general intentionally, because others will want to ask more detailed questions in these areas. You touched on the internal market proposals. In the Scottish Government's initial assessment of the UK's internal market proposals, you provided a case study for the potential impact on food and drink sector. and that stated that the continuity bill will allow the Scottish Government to keep pace with high environmental and social and regulatory standards provided by EU law, which apply to this sector. But we also heard evidence that the internal market proposals potentially undermine these policy choices. Could you explain to us why you think that might be the case, and how the Scottish Government intends to respond to this potential constraint on the use of its devolved powers? And then we'll go to Murdo Fraser.
Well, we have no intention of acceding to the internal market bill. It is only just published today, though the speed with which it's being pushed through is obscene in actual fact. What we intend to do is to resist that bill. It'll be resisted in the House of Commons. It'll be resisted by Wales as well as Scotland. It'll be resisted cross-party, I'm sure, here, with the exception of the Tories. And we will continue to challenge it in the House of Commons, in the House of Lords. We will look at other options for challenging it. So I don't accept it is a done deal by any manner of means. I think it is quite clear, however, that were it to be successfully passed, and if it were to be observed in Scotland, and were the UK to accede to lower standards, which I think is inevitable. I mean, I know the US-UK trade talks are recommencing today. I think The Independent has published something today about a documentation from last year's discussions in which full market access was what the US was seeking. And that means in agriculture, for example, a lowering of food standards. If those were lowered to allow the UK to accede to those trade deals, which will be because the UK is desperate to do those deals, in those circumstances, then American providers and importers could successfully go to law, in my view, to challenge high standards in Scotland. Scotland has a right to choose what standards it has. Scotland has had high standards as a member of the EU, and has a right to continue with those high standards. And they should not be undermined by will or diktat from the UK Parliament, which essentially leaves the Scottish people defenceless. And that's what will happen. So we are determined to oppose the bill, and we will go on opposing the bill. And it is not a done deal.
Okay, Murdo Fraser, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Murdo.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I wanted to ask you about the issue of parliamentary scrutiny. That has been a theme in all our evidence sessions so far. And we've heard this expressed in evidence from Professor McHarg, from Professor Keating, from the Law Society, the Faculty of Advocates, the National Farmers Union of Scotland, and others. And essentially the concern is that while there may be a case for giving ministers powers to introduce by secondary legislation, what are minor changes to existing EU laws? Less strong case, if there's a case at all, for giving ministers that power to introduce substantial new laws and significant policy changes, which should properly be done by primary legislation. And I noticed that the same point is made in the report we've just seen from the DPLR committee. So can I ask you, how can you justify proceeding with this bill, which is giving such sweeping powers to ministers to introduce new laws by way of secondary legislation?
Well, I don't accept it's giving ministers powers, sweeping powers to introduce new laws by means of secondary legislation. So presumably the premise of your question is what I would take objection to first of all. The reality of the situation is that we've made it clear, and indeed I did so in my opening remarks, that where primary legislation is required for particularly major pieces of work or legislation, we are open to that. But primary legislation is not required for more minor pieces, nor for keeping pace with existing standards as they develop. It would be a waste of parliamentary time, and it would be a means by which those who are opposed to any keeping pace would be able to frustrate the legitimate will of the Scottish people to keep pace with high standards. It would, in other words, be a Trojan horse that would be introduced to stop this bill being effective. Now, the levels of parliamentary scrutiny within this bill are entirely clear. They consist of an either-or power. And, of course, there's always scope in every bill, and I don't think I've ever taken a bill through the Scottish Parliament that has not, in the end, had major discussions about whether negative, affirmative, or super-affirmative power regulations are what should be, secondary legislation powers should be used. And of course, we can have that debate as we move into stage 2. And I predict that there will be amendments laid by you and others to change negative to affirmative and affirmative to super affirmative. That is what happens. But it would be an astonishing use of parliamentary time if we were to have to use primary legislation to keep pace with every single European regulation. Nobody else does that. It is not required. The other issue I would draw attention to is the flexibility that I've indicated in my opening remarks as to the process we follow and the consultation we follow and the way in which people suggest we should keep pace. Because this is not something that government alone will decide. There will be committees of the Parliament, there will be interest groups, there will be third sector groups, there will be businesses who will want us to ensure that the highest standards are maintained and that we keep pace with European standards. For example, on water quality regulation, which is a key issue, there are new powers coming in through the EU which will deal with higher water quality standards and issues such as plastics, which it would be necessary and useful for us to adapt to, as we would have done as a member of the EU, as quickly as possible. So I think those are all reasonable ways in which to move forward with the highest level of parliamentary scrutiny and the highest level of consultation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that response. I mean, you used in your response to me the argument that to proceed by primary legislation in the event of a new policy change would be a waste of parliamentary time. Now, I asked the Bill team at the very start of this process if they could tell me how many significant measures they anticipated would be brought in on an annual basis under this legislation. And they were not able to tell me that. So I cannot understand how the policy memorandum makes the case that it can't be done by primaries, it would be too burdensome. You've just repeated that. And yet neither the Bill team, unless you can tell us now, can give us a figure for how many primary bills we might be talking about, unless you can tell us that now.
Well, quite clearly you would have to go through all the measures that we might intend to keep pace with and to come to some assessment as to whether they were major or minor. But no other country. Well, if you would like me to answer you, I'm quite happy to answer you, but I do have to take the opportunity to do so. You would have to go through all of those and say, now, in terms of specific items, one set of items that might be subject to it in a normal year, there have been up to 70 minor items which are changed, and that would seem entirely reasonable. But I don't think that we would wish to keep pace with 70. I don't think we have the capability, even with the secondary legislation, of keeping pace in that way. So, regrettably, because the people of Scotland, as you know, voted to stay in the EU and are being dragged out of the EU against their will, regrettably, we cannot keep pace with the highest of standards in everything, even in the environmental sphere, let alone in any other range of areas which we would be interested in. But to say that on every occasion, when we wanted to continue to keep pace with, for example, an issue such as water quality or fish diseases, that we would have to go through the full primary route would be an astonishing waste of parliamentary time and would be a Trojan horse to stop these powers being used and would be used by people who do not wish Scotland to keep pace. The fanatical Brexiteers for whom the very mention of European regulation is anathema. And I think the people of Scotland deserve to have the highest of standards, and that is what we're seeking to provide.
Well, thank you for that response, but it's a very strange characterisation of Bodies Farmers Union for Scotland, who have expressed the concerns I've outlined to you today about, for example, new environmental measures being brought in that do not go through the full route of consultation and parliamentary scrutiny. To dismiss them as fanatical Brexiteers is frankly ludicrous.
Well, I didn't do that. I would be grateful if you didn't put words in my mouth. I'd be really grateful for that.
Well, that is the term you use, Secretary, to cover people who express concern about this bill. But if I can perhaps conclude my question.
Concern about your approach to it, not their approach to it. I think you are misrepresenting their.
Because for those of us who are listening here, all we're hearing is two sets of voices talking across each other. So if each of you, in turn, could just not interrupt each other, that would be helpful.
Convener,
Thank you,
just
Convener. Perhaps I can...
I'm trying to ensure words are not put into my mouth. I did not criticise anybody. I indicated that there was an attempt to put words into my mouth, and I'm not going to take that.
I understand that, but let's just so otherwise, in this particular setup, it's very difficult for those members and probably the public to understand what's going on. There's two talking across each other. And Murdo, you did interrupt Michael the first time round. He interrupted you in terms of your question, so you've both been at it. So just keep it to each one at a time, please.
Thank you, Convener. Perhaps I'll continue with my question. I think, just to close that off, the point I was making was the concerns over this legislation go far beyond people who could be dismissed as fanatical Brexiteers. But we'll leave it at that. I suppose and I suppose this will be my final question, Convener. It's simply this. Cabinet Secretary, you spent a lot of time talking about power grabs. This is exactly what this bill is as it stands. It is giving sweeping powers to Scottish ministers to introduce new laws to Scotland without the required level of parliamentary scrutiny and consultation. That is what the responses have been telling us to those who've given evidence to this committee over the previous weeks. Isn't it time for you to think again?
I know the Conservatives are keen not to allow legislation to proceed. That's what you'll be attempting to do this afternoon as well in another place. That is not the evidence we've been receiving. Where there are concerns about primary and secondary legislation, we've been prepared to address those. I have made clear in my opening remarks that I think that there is a ground for primary legislation in case of major innovation. I've never denied that. You're the one who appears to be denying that. I am absolutely happy with that. But it would be, and I repeat this, both a waste of parliamentary time to use it for every small change of legislation, which is what you have been suggesting. Secondly, I believe that the Tory hostility to this bill and to the EU is unbalancing this debate. And I'm prepared to stand up vigorously for the right of Scotland not to be, A, dragged out of Europe against its will, and secondly, have the high standards to which we are used and which we have in place trashed in order to have a trade deal forced upon us, a bad trade deal by the UK government. I will not have that, and I'm determined to fight against it.
Can I ask, Alec Rowley, is it a supplementary, Alec, that you wish to ask at this stage?
Yeah.
Okay, Alec Rowley, please.
Thanks, Convener. Can I think the Tories are in complete denial of the devastating impact that Brexit is going to have. And therefore, we're unlikely to have a reasonable debate with any Tories. But can I ask, you highlighted there, Cabinet Secretary, like the example of higher water quality being a really good example where we would want to maintain standards that the European Union have. But given all these different bills that are coming forward just now with Brexit, so there's a trade bill, the internal market bill, can I ask, are we confident that the bill that's going through just now, this bill, would be able to deliver on the example you gave, higher water quality, or is there any of the other legislation going through the UK Parliament that could supersede and indeed overrule this? That would be my question.
I think it's a very good question, Mr. Rowley, because I fear the situation of the internal bill will be used to undermine devolution in many of its aspects. So it is also possible, and it's happened before, that the Advocate General will attempt to challenge this bill, or the bill is clearly within competence and has been recognised as being within competence. But I think what we should do is to put in place the legislation, the regulation that we believe we need to take forward the highest of standards, and I think we should continue to oppose those who are trying to stop that happening. And should they continue to try that, then we should work very hard to stop that interference in the right of Scotland. And I make this point very clearly, and I know you agree with it. Whatever your position on the Constitution, the areas which are devolved to the Scottish Parliament has the right to choose the standards that are applied and to ensure they are applied in Scotland. And that is a basic tenet of devolution. And in those circumstances, we should insist upon it, and we should pass legislation to ensure that we have that right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can I move now to Tom Arthur, please?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The context in which this bill operates will not only be determined by whatever legislation is passed by Westminster, but whatever agreement, if any, is reached between the UK Government and the European Union. Cabinet Secretary, can you update the committee as to regards to what dialogue you have had with the UK Government vis-à-vis their negotiations with the European Union? And with regards to scenario planning for after the 1st of January, what are the central assumptions that the Scottish Government is working towards?
Thank you, Mr. Arthur. There was a meeting of the Joint Ministerial Committee on Thursday. There was an update, if one can call it that, from David Frost given to the JMC. I can't say I learnt any more than I could read in newspapers in those circumstances, and all that I know is gleaned either from that, from the newspapers, or from conversations with others who are engaged in the process. I don't think it's just news to anybody to know that those talks appear to be deadlocked, and they appear to be particularly fractious, particularly on the UK side, with all sorts of statements being made at the weekend about insisting that the EU understand the position. And then we have yesterday's unfortunate development in the House of Commons, which has produced a very negative reaction, even amongst the most friendly of countries, for example, in Ireland, where both the new Taoiseach and the Taoiseach have both, and the Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, in the last 24 hours have all indicated real concern about the willingness to flout international law. So as far as I am concerned, all I fear is that this is a process that is going nowhere. Even if it was to produce a result, the result that the UK is looking for at the moment is what I would have been calling a low deal. It is a very, very unambitious deal, and it's essentially the bare bones. And we should reflect, never stop reflecting on the fact that the UK is the only country in history which has gone into a negotiation endeavouring to get a worse deal than the one it entered with. It wants to walk out of the room with a worse deal than what it already has. So I'm not sanguine about the prospects. I think whatever happens, problem. So we have a very active amount of work going on in government, preparing for the end of transition and the 1st of January. I'm reporting regularly to the Cabinet upon that. I can say that we are now getting, and indeed as a result of the JMC, I think, we've now had the reasonable worst case planning assumptions government. We still do not get enough information on what they are doing. There is a meeting, I think, tomorrow afternoon with the Paymaster General, which is meant to look at one or two further details. But trying to get information out of the UK government is often like pulling teeth, and it's information we need on transition. I should make a final point. When we've dealt with no-deal planning, in two major occasions we've done that, there was a clear understanding, both I think were when David Liddington posed, there was a clear understanding between Liddington himself and Liddington and Mark Drakeford and then Jeremy Miles in Wales, that this would be out with the normal politics, that we would find a way to ensure that we could work on this without the usual political difficulties. That's not the case now. We've seen that recently in other newspapers and elsewhere. This is it's handled in a very political way by the UK government, which is designed to undermine and damage other governments of these islands, and that's to be regretted.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm conscious in these exchanges and in other exchanges we've had with previous evidence sessions with regards to this bill, we routinely slip into talking in abstract and legalistic terms, but I wondered for a moment if you could perhaps sketch out what the practical implications will be for perhaps your constituents, for example, of leaving without a deal or leaving with a no deal after 1st January, and how the powers provided for in this bill could help to address some of these concerns and issues.
Well, I'm very nervous and concerned about standards, food standards, environmental standards, the range of standards that we would take as normal in Scotland. And the internal market bill will allow all of those standards to be undermined progressively, and that's what will take place. That lower standards will be set, no matter what the UK government says at the present moment. The lower standards will be set, and those are the standards that will be forced to prevail. So that concerns me. In food standards, for example, that's about basic health issues. Countries that have lower food standards tend to have more illness as a result of lower food standards, and that's simply reality. That's where things are. You could then, you could then take sectors and say, how will sectors be affected? I mean, for example, the Scottish seafood producers were saying yesterday that they're very worried about a situation in which they would have major amounts of phytosanitary inspection, which will hold up shipments and massively increase the cost of shipments of seafood going out of the country. Now, if I look at my own constituency, we have a whole range of small seafood producers. I think the village of Tarbert has 11 or 12 processors, and that will be hugely disadvantageous. And I declare an interest. I'm an honorary president of the Clyde Fishermen's Association, but I also know that there is a possibility that fishermen will have to base themselves in Ireland in order to take advantage of of selling stuff directly into the EU. So there are practical difficulties. I had a fascinating conversation earlier in this week with somebody who knows far more than I do about logistics. And the reality, for example, of exporting and importing is that the systems aren't ready. That they're absolutely not ready. We know that from what the hauliers have been saying to the UK government, publicly saying to the UK government. And the person I was talking to me said, in the end, they can get the systems to work. They won't be working by the 31st of December. Some of the computer systems aren't even written yet. But in the end, they can probably get into work, a year, 18 months or whatever. But the long-term issue is all that business will be much more difficult and much more expensive. Because there will be more bureaucracy and paperwork as a result of it, no matter what happens. And that's, even if there is no tariffs, and the great attention is on tariffs, the actual logistics of trade and on which jobs depend will become much more difficult. And there is no pot of gold at the end of this rainbow. The implication is that once we've got shot of the EU, there will be some fantastic set of arrangements that we will have with America or whoever knows, Alpha Centauri. It's simply not going to happen. There isn't anything to compensate in the same way for it. So this is a downward spiral. And it's pretty tough for us as politicians to have to be honest with our constituents and say the UK government is presently forcing you into a downward spiral. That's why having an option of something else, of the normality of being an independent country as part of the EU, is the thing that we should also be talking about.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And on that, for my final question on that point, you're right, there is an alternative future for Scotland rather than the bleak isolationism of Brexit. In your opening statement, you made reference to the sunset period for this bill being 10 years with opportunity for extension, and that this could include a period for the accession of an independent Scotland to the European Union. Now, given the support for independence is at 55%, given that people of my generation in their 30s and youngers overwhelmingly rejected Brexit and overwhelmingly support independence, can you outline how this bill will enable Scotland, both as it stands at the moment before an independence referendum and after an independence referendum, to prepare for accession to the European Union as a full independent member state?
Well, one of the useful effects of this bill will be to maintain regulation that would otherwise atrophy. What you don't want to happen is for the standards to slip, and to slip in a way that would take a long time to get back to them. I mean, I'm absolutely certain that accession can be achieved well within any period within this bill. But that having been said, you don't want standards to slip, because the further they slip, the further back you have to come. So this bill has the useful effect of making sure that in areas we choose, and we can't do in all areas, in areas we choose, we don't let those standards slip.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Now we go to Dean Lockhart. Dean, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I would like to bring the discussion back to the terms of the Continuity Bill itself. And giving evidence to this committee, Professor Eileen McHarg explained that whereas previously UK members of the European Parliament would be fully involved in the formation of EU law, this will not be the case in the future under the EU Continuity Bill. In her words, we will become purely rule takers. And the Professor went on to say, in these circumstances, it seems very hard to justify putting extensive powers into the hands of Scottish ministers to keep pace. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, given these concerns, can he confirm what influence, if any, the Scottish Government will have on the future direction or content of EU laws that it intends to keep pace with?
Well, clearly I would be much happier, Mr. Lockhart, if we had MEPs who were taking part in that process. And indeed, that's what we should have. And that's what we aspire to have. And that's what we're not going to have because of the actions of your party and your government against the will of the Scottish people. So, the regret in that is all mine, but the blame in that is all yours. But that having been said, the best is the enemy of the good. What we really now have to do is to make up as much ground as we can by trying to make sure that in the limited areas, because we won't have the space to do it entirely, in the limited areas in which we can keep pace and choose to keep pace, then we do so in the most effective way possible, and we do so in the way that has the most scrutiny possible. And that's what we're endeavouring to do. And as I said in my opening remarks, we don't rule out primary legislation in particular significant areas, but we also believe that operationally and sensibly there are other areas that can come through by means of normal parliamentary scrutiny, and there will be parliamentary scrutiny. As said to Mr. Fraser, the balance between negative, affirmative and super affirmative a resolution will be one, no doubt, that we will work out in the course of the bill, as always happens. But I don't think there is anything inherently wrong with the proposals, and providing the Parliament has the opportunity to scrutinise and can also be proactive in the process of developing our approach, then I think that's beneficial. Final point I would make is, of course, we will endeavour, as third countries often do, by means of presence in Brussels and by active debate, to make it clear what our views are. It would indeed be far better, and I agree with you that we had full democratic participation in making these regulations in Brussels, and I really look forward to the time when we do have that again.
Thank you for that response, Cabinet Secretary. In an answer to Tom Arthur, you said that part of the rationale of the bill was to maintain regulatory alignment with the EU system. But if you adopt your ad hoc pick and mix approach to which regulations and directives to follow, surely that defeats the purpose of maintaining regulatory alignment, and Scotland will end up in a regulatory no man's land.
No, I don't follow that. Insofar as we're able to do so, we will do it to the maximum of our ability, but we cannot do it all because we're being deprived of the core tool, which is full independent membership. That's why we want to get full independent membership. But no, I don't think that being only able to do it in some things, it's still better than not doing it at all, which is, of course, what the UK has been trying to force us. That's the position they've been trying to force us into. And we're not willing to be forced into that position.
The reason I raised that concern, Cabinet Secretary, is that was evidence we were given in previous sessions. And indeed, the Environment Committee had received evidence that it's unclear whether Scotland will keep pace with the EU, adopt similar standards to the rest of the UK, or take a completely different approach. In other words, the evidence we got was that there is a risk that Scotland could be, in the end of the day, out of sync with the EU regulations and also out of sync with regulations in the rest of the UK. And that's the possible consequence of the EU Continuity Bill. Does the Cabinet Secretary recognise the uncertainty this will create for business across Scotland, having to potentially comply with 3 different regulatory systems? In other words, EU regulations for exporters, devolved powers in Scotland, and different regulations in the rest of the UK. You referred to uncertainty earlier. Doesn't this bill introduce massive uncertainty for business in Scotland?
Oh, absolutely not. What it does is it provides certainty in the midst of the complete burach of uncertainty produced by the current UK Tory government. It provides clarity, because the clarity is when we know European regulations, which people observe now, and we choose to stay with those European regulations, then that will be absolutely clear. I think you are, with respect, trying to sow a bit of uncertainty yourself, I'm sure, unwittingly. But, one could go on from 3. One could say we could align ourselves with other things. You could build the confusion. It's actually very simple. We will want to continue as much as we can with European regulation. That is also democratic, because that's what the people of Scotland want to do. We do not wish to go down the aggressive deregulating line that the UK government is bent upon doing to lower standards in order to get bad trade deals. And we want to support Scottish business. And unfortunately, the Internal Market Bill will also damage Scottish business because it will provide unfair competition to Scottish business, because it will create the circumstances where businesses in England particularly will be able to dominate the Scottish market. And we think that's very, very unfortunate. And we just wish that the Scottish Conservatives would stand with the rest of us to defend the devolution settlement and Scottish business against those encroachments. You would be very welcome.
No, well, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, our priority, as always, is to protect and secure the internal market with the rest of the UK, which, as you know, accounts for more than 60% of Scotland's trade and also protects more than 500,000 jobs in Scotland, according to the Fraser Vallender. So that's, I think, in all of this, the economic priority of the Internal Market Bill is to secure that internal market as the priority. But, Convener, I appreciate I've taken up quite a bit of time, so I'm happy to leave it there. Thank you.
We'll take that as a statement rather than a question, then, Mr. Dean. In which case, I'll now go to John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. I don't know whether I'm depressed by all of this so far, but anyway, we'll keep going. I mean, Cabinet Secretary, you've touched on quite a lot of issues around standards so far, and we had the National Farmers Union of Scotland in, and I mean, they clearly want to sell products to the rest of the UK, but they also want to sell products to the rest of Europe, and they're fearful that, for example, poorer products be used in English farms, and then these products could come into Scotland. I mean, is it possible to square this circle? Can we maintain the high standards with Europe at the same time as the UK appears to be undermining standards? And in fact, even if we have an agreement with the UK, we now know that we cannot trust them.
Well, alas, that is true, Mr. Mason, and regrettably the whole world is discovering that after yesterday. There is no reason why there can't be a sensible solution to all these problems. The frameworks are the way to do so. I mean, Mr. Lockhart made his definitive statement at the end, clearly wanting to get the answer in before the question. But I just want to make it absolutely clear that I am committed to the highest of standards and the absolute openness of the internal market. There's a lot of nonsense talked about the internal market, of course. I was lectured on this by Alex Sharma yesterday on the history of the internal market, which I found a bit curious. I mean, the internal market is not something that has existed since time immemorial with one set of regulations for these islands. I mean, one can only really look at the fact that even time was only regulated in 1840 with the arrival of the railways, and I think the Great Western regulated railway time. Up until then, there wasn't even the same time being observed in every part of these islands. So the reality is that this is a comparatively modern concept, and it's a concept that can be dealt with and will be dealt with and was meant to be dealt with by the frameworks process, which is if we discovered any impediment to the internal market, and nobody's ever been able to point one out to me, that this whole edifice of a bill from the UK is predicated upon a non-existent problem as far as I can see. But if there is a problem, the frameworks can undoubtedly deal with it. And they are voluntary frameworks that we're putting in place. So we could actually short-circuit all of this difficulty, all the time that's going to be spent upon this, all the angst that's involved in this, if we simply said, look, the work we've done on the frameworks has been good. There's more to be done. We can accelerate that. We can make commitments to ensure that there are no barriers within it. And actually, that is what the National Farmers Union said they wanted in the consultation on the Internal Market Bill, as the Scottish Council for Development Industry, as a whole range of others, said, look, we want the devolution settlement to continue as it is. We want the frameworks to operate, give them the opportunity to operate, and let's do it that way. And for a variety of reasons, the fear, I think, of not being able to impose trade deals, and also what I think, I've called it before, I think a deep-rooted dislike of devolution within the current UK government and a sovereigntist view. The Westminster Parliament must always have the final say, even in areas of devolved competence. We've come to this very unfortunate pass. You started your question, Mr. Mason, by saying you didn't know whether to be depressed or not. I think you should be depressed, but I think you should also be slightly hopeful that sense might prevail, even with the current UK government.
That made you feel
Okay,
better.
thank you very much for that answer. I've just one other point, which is a completely different point. We got evidence from some of the environmental witnesses that they were actually keen that we should go further and not just enable ministers to keep pace, but to require ministers to keep pace. How would you respond to that suggestion?
Yes, I mean, I am aware that, as ever with a piece of government legislation, you have forces on both sides that want you to do things, those that don't want you to do it, and those who want to do more. I think we've got the balance about right, but I am more than willing to say that we should have means by which we can listen to and respond to people outside the Parliament, people outside politics, about what we should be keeping pace with. So whilst I don't believe we should be able to be mandated to keep pace, I do believe that we should be very sensitive to those who have views about what we keep pace with.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Alec Rowley, I'm not sure in your supplementary whether that was also your main question. Do you want to ask a question now?
Yeah, please.
On you, Alec.
Can I just pick up on that point, Cabinet Secretary? You talked about frameworks, and I know that you say the Scottish Government entered that with a real desire to try and make it happen. Perhaps you could maybe reflect on, because I know that Michael Clancy for the Law Society Scotland talks about dispute resolution, and he argues that the real idea would be to seek consensus in advance and avoid the dispute in the first place. And he talks about the GIMC in there. But my understanding is it 20 years on for devolution that we really need to look at all these mechanisms? Are they not working as well as they could, given where we are, basically? I wonder if you could perhaps say a bit about that. He's somebody who actually believes devolution is the best way forward, but that we have to have in place mechanisms.
I respect that, and I respect the position of the Labour Party in Wales equally on the issue of they want to see an effective dispute resolution mechanism, and quite a lot of work has gone into that. It is a sort of holy grail of devolution. If you could get an effective dispute resolution procedure in place, then you could at least get some stability into the current situation. You could be able to work well with people. I think I've said at this committee before that I was very struck hearing Leo Varadkar one day at the British Irish Council talk about the way in which trust in the EU, that all existing 27 members trusted each other, not because they thought they were all nice people and and they could go out for a drink with them, but because there was a legal framework on which that trust hung. That in actual fact you knew there was a way in which you could enforce how you had to work together. There is nothing like that in the relationship of these islands. This is an unwritten constitution. Essentially, the dispute resolution procedure presently is when there is a dispute, the UK government says nothing to see here, move on please, because it will not take seriously things like, for example, the fact that the money to the DUP in 2017 was not Barnetized, but they simply refused to discuss the issue. The barrier to dispute resolution is the medieval concept of the sovereignty of the UK Parliament, which means that it cannot essentially be overruled or bound or subject to the same regulations as anybody else. If you could put in place the equity between those parliaments, you could have an effective dispute resolution procedure. It is still not been resolved. I mean, the intergovernmental review creaks on. I was involved in a meeting about it about 3 weeks ago. That is the basic problem. Until the UK government accepts that there requires to be equity in the relationship, it'll be very difficult to see how it could work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. Angela Constance, please.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Last week we heard some evidence from the Human Rights Consortium, and you're probably aware that in their written submission they would like Section 6 of the bill to be amended, effectively to state that ministers should have due regard to their obligations under the Human Rights Act. Now, your bill were of the view that this is unnecessary. Ms Snowden last week said that as the Human Rights Act is increasingly being challenged at a UK level, that there is a need to do everything to ensure that it is secure in Scots law, and I wondered if you agreed with that or not.
I do agree with that. I think it's an issue that we need to address as we move to stage 2 of the bill. I think it is taken as read, and you and I think, hope that we live in a world in which such things are taken as read. Regrettably, and even more so after yesterday, I don't think we can take anything as read, not even the rule of international law. So I am more than willing now to consider how we would move ahead with that one, and I shall ask my officials to have discussions with the relevant organisations to see if we can agree a way forward.
Thank you for that, Cabinet Secretary. I think that will be very much appreciated. Human rights stakeholders are very supportive of the work that the Scottish Government is doing to bring international human rights directly into Scots law. But the keeping pace effort is about ensuring that we don't go below a minimum standard. So given that the UK doesn't even see ECHR as a basic minimum in trade negotiations either with the EU or other countries, are we still not in real danger of being the poor man of Europe when it comes to human rights?
It is distinctly possible that is the situation that is developing. I mean, it's very, very difficult to predict what will happen next with the current UK government. I mean, if there is a genuine agenda to refuse to accept the norms of international law, and to say that, for example, treaties would not be binding if you choose them not to be binding, and some incredible stuff. I mean, not just Brandon Lewis yesterday. I mean, and he didn't misspeak. I mean, clearly he was working from a briefing, and I don't think he could have misread his briefing that much. If he did not, but others were doing so. I was astonished to hear Bernard Jenkins yesterday, who's not an unreasonable human being, making it clear that he always knew, because he was obviously told by the UK government that they would repudiate this, and all you had to do was to vote for it and sign on for it to get yourself past the hump of leaving the EU, and then you could cast it aside. Now, you can't do business in those terms. I mean, in a sense, I feel that I've had this experience for far too long in dealing with the UK government. It doesn't surprise me, but it does depress me that we've got to that stage, and it's been getting worse and worse. And I think in those circumstances, we need to find ways to reassert in Scotland what we believe and the values we have. And I would make the point, these are mainstream European values. There's nothing exceptional about what we're talking about. They are ordinary, mainstream human values, European values, which we would take as read, but which now appear to be almost exceptional in what the UK believes.
The Cabinet Secretary makes the point that human rights and other values are very often agreed at an international level, and he's also made the point this morning that Britannia waives the rules, both its own rules as well as international agreements. But the purpose of Mr Russell's bill is, as I understand it, as much as possible to prevent Scotland going backwards, trying to mitigate being dragged out of the EU against our will. But at the end of the day, how on earth can we compensate for a low or no deal? How can we compensate for trade trumping our rights? And how can we compensate for the biggest power grab, or as you describe, assault on devolution? So is there just not a bigger point here? Is there just not a bigger bill here, perhaps, that just, at a fundamental level says we're really just not prepared to put up with this, and we're not prepared to put up with it any longer? I mean, I'm, much older than Mr Arthur, not quite as old as the Cabinet Secretary, but, can we not just get them tell?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think we're at that stage, and I think being blunt about it does no harm.
I'll take that as your last question and point, Angela, and move on to Patrick Harvey. Patrick?
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Okay, two questions. Can I first of all just pick up on this issue around keeping pace and whether the Scottish Government should be able to or should have a duty to? One of the examples that was raised last week was glyphosate. The decision a couple of years ago was not to bringing a ban on glyphosate at EU level. There's a very strong argument in favour of a ban, but at that point it was put off for a few years, and I think we're expecting that decision to be reviewed in a year or two's time. And I think in that time Germany has since changed its position. If the balance within the EU, subsequent to the UK leaving and not having a vote in that decision, is that they do support a ban on glyphosate, and the UK continues not to support that, you would take the view that the Scottish Government should not be required to keep pace by introducing that ban, but should be able to make that decision. Would you also accept that this bill needs to provide the opportunity for people in Scotland to challenge that decision in either direction? That if yourselves or a future Scottish Government was to decide to go with the UK position rather than the EU, we can't have a framework for these decisions that allows that just to be nodded through. It has to be open to challenge publicly, not just through consultation, but through public engagement, and also in Parliament through a formal process. Is that reasonable? And is that what this bill achieves? Or is there a danger that it gives too much power to ministers simply to make a decision and have Parliament take it or leave it?
I think it does give the power of challenge is there. I mean, the power of challenge is always there in terms of, for example, judicial review of a decision. But the power of challenge is there within the bill. I mean, there is a power of challenge to any decision that is made in the bill because it's not made, without regulation, and regulation can be challenged. But I do think there is an issue. Let me take that actual example. I can't imagine circumstances in which that does not become a live debate, as this issue is revisited. I think it will be a very active debate. I'm quite sure in this Parliament, the Environment Committee would wish to be part of that discussion. I'm sure that the third sector would wish to be part of that discussion. And the government would want to be and should be mindful of that debate before it makes its decision. And when it makes the decision to ban or not ban, to keep pace or not keep pace, then that is challengeable by politicians, members of the Parliament, through the committee structure and through the regulations as they will go through, or otherwise. And it is also, as I say, subject to the normal challenges of judicial review, for example. So I think it is in there. I think it should be in there. I think the difficulty with mandating and an opportunity to mandate to keep pace is that it is indiscriminate. And I think that the government might well find itself pretty overwhelmed in those circumstances. And this is something that's going to take resource. We do not have unlimited resource. So at the present moment, whilst we are not an independent member, I think we've got the right solution. When we return to full membership, we will be mandated because it will be our duty to observe these regulations, but we will also be in the process of making them. And that will be a very healthy thing to be.
Maybe by focusing on Roundup, I'm making the same mistake as those who focus on chlorinated chicken, that you just have one issue that everyone fixates on, when actually there would be hundreds of lower level issues that don't become big political debates.
Yeah.
Would you agree that there is at least a case for a sifting mechanism to ensure that the proper level of scrutiny is brought to bear on these measures? Rather than a danger that we have the lowest common denominator in terms of scrutiny and debate?
I think the sifting mechanism lies in the existing committee structure, and those who will be concerned about this, when it is known that this power is in the armoury, when we have this power in the armoury, and providing it is not treated in the same disgraceful way as was the previous power treated by the UK government, then when we know this is in the armoury, then I would be highly surprised if each and every committee of the Parliament was not considering issues that it wished to be included in this way. I'm not necessarily in favour of a new sifting committee. I think we have difficulty staffing the structures that we have. I'm not sure that we would want more structures, but I do think there will be an opportunity for each committee to do this, and I'm happy about that. And I said in my introductory remarks, I mean, I am giving thought, and I'm very happy to take thought from others too, about how that whole process can work. And maybe we should continue to talk about that as we go into stage 2 and stage 3.
Well, I think there probably will be opportunities to look at a number of options at stage 2. But I wanted also to ask about the interaction of this bill with the internal market bill and with future trade agreements. A number of other members have already discussed this with you. So rather than going over the same ground again, let's just acknowledge the UK government and the Scottish government have fundamentally different purposes here. One wants to maintain a close relationship with the European Union with a view to getting back in. The other wants to cut those ties and have a deregulation agenda, or at least permit a deregulation agenda. These are not compatible objectives, and so the question rests with where does power lie? Is there not a case? Is it not overdue, in fact, that the Scottish Government takes that question to court and asks whether the UK Government's interpretation of its power to legislate, not normally in devolved areas, actually whenever it sees fit? Not normally, apparently to the UK Government, just means not unless we feel like it, not unless we want to. Is it not time for the Scottish Government to take that to court and seek a judicial review on what that means? Because there can be no resolution of this with any kind of equanimity if there is no equanimity of power.
I don't disagree with your analysis. I think it is about power. I think it is about the misuse of power by the UK government. I think, without a doubt, and their overbearing approach to this is very clear. I am cautious always about going to court. There's an unwritten constitution, and it's very difficult to enforce that. But I can say to you, as I've said before to this committee, and I'm happy to say to you again, I have not ruled out any actions. I'm not necessarily going to advertise those actions before they're taken. I have not ruled out any actions at all, and I hear clearly what you are saying. There may be a range of legal options in front of us, but I wouldn't want to go any further than that at this stage.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Patrick. George Adam, please. Mr. Adam?
Yes, just wait for my camera to go in there, Convener. Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to ask about, just to go into a wee bit more detail about common frameworks, because to me, if you have people with different opinions, different ideals, different beliefs, surely having sitting down and having that opportunity to be able to discuss them and take them forward is surely a more sensible manner than actually the proposals from the UK government at the moment, which is effectively to, as you've already said, run roughshod through devolution. Cabinet Secretary, what are the threats that we face because of this attitude, and how do we try and find a way to get some form of compromise with a UK government that appears not to?
Well, the compromise is there to be had, and I've made that very clear, and I've not only made it clear, in committee appearances, I made it very clear, for example, again last week at the Joint Ministerial Committee, and I made it clear yesterday in my conversation with Alex Sharma and Michael Gove. The solution is, as you say, with a civilised and sensible approach, in which we sit down with the frameworks and we say, is there anything missing from this programme? Michael Gove asserts there is, but he hasn't said what. If it is missing, let's put that in place. Let's make a commitment, all of us, that we will operate as if the frameworks are in place while we finalise the details of them. And we will make a commitment to placing no barriers in the way of internal trade, which there are no barriers. We've never had any intention of putting any barriers in place, neither has anybody else, as far as I can see. So it's an entire chimera. But if that makes Michael Gove feel better, then there'll be no such barriers. That's available to us. We could do it today, and that would then resolve this issue. But instead, what the UK want to do is twofold. They want to bring this bill in, and then they also want to make assertions about the bill which, frankly, aren't true. I mean, I read the comments from the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, and they are simply untrue, I'm sorry to say. The internal trade issue is not at risk. There is no threat to the internal trade in these islands. And to assert there is, and moreover to say that that threat would lead to the loss of 500,000 jobs or something, is just not true. And I think this is being devilled by that type of spin and bluster, because the resolution of this is very, very simple. It should never have come along in the first place. And in case people think that this is just the SNP yet again, go and look at the statement from the Welsh Government. And you will see that, if anything, they're even angrier about this, because they know they've put the effort in, as we've put the effort in, to try and make the frameworks work. And they're there. And it is, well, it's just extraordinary that any responsible government would behave in this way.
Cabinet Secretary, you've said that the UK Internal Market Bill that's going to be published at one point today, if it's not already been done so, is a major threat to devolution. And you said you hope the UK government sees sense. Ever the optimist, you've said you hope they see sense. But, the narrative from many of our unionist colleagues on this committee seems to be along the lines that, this is just the nationalists trying to pick a fight. This is us just the way we are. We can't help ourselves. But, when I've been looking at some of and I know Twitter isn't the centre of the universe and everything's going on, but even with unionist correspondence, I've got one here that actually says you can't run a complex union state like the UK as a majoritarian unitary state. If even unionist correspondents are writing things like that, surely, as you say, people should see sense and we should be able to have that conversation. It's not just the nationalists, it's the Welsh Government as well. So surely we can get to a place where we can get that compromise.
I entirely agree with you. We have enough difficulty, in dealing with whatever the outcome of the negotiations is, whether it is no deal or low deal. Our hands are going to be full for the rest of this year, coping with that. Something we didn't ask for, we didn't vote for, we're having to cope with it. The whole of the last 4 years is a story of a failure to compromise by the UK, starting with Theresa May's failure to talk sensibly to people and to bring people into discussion. And it has simply been a story of galloping extremism, which has deliberately excluded other points of view, as you say, in a majoritarian sense. And it has led us to this. It has led us to the spectacle of a UK cabinet minister endorsing essentially illegality yesterday in the House of Commons, and a bill which is unwanted, which the Scottish Parliament has voted against, which the Welsh Parliament will vote against, which we will not give legislative consent to, I'm sure, in Scotland. They will not give it in Wales. There is huge upset in Northern Ireland. The whole process of peace process in the Northern Ireland and the establishment and continuation of Stormont is all at risk because of this utter obsession about something which in our looks a majority of the people in these islands no longer support. It's an utter tragedy. And if only there was a reasonable sense of a way out, then how good that would be.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you, Convener.
Okay, lastly, Cabinet Secretary, final question from me around the issue of common sense and a way out. Now, understandably, the Scottish Government have put a lot of store in the common frameworks, and these being the process to enable a sensible way forward for the whole of the islands of the United Kingdom. I just wonder if these negotiations on the common frameworks are still going on, how can they possibly proceed to success at the same time as the UK Internal Market Bill is proceeding through the House of Commons? Does that not really mean potentially the end of common frameworks?
Well, I think it's a very sensible question. It's not just the frameworks process, very important as that is, the intergovernmental review. How can you continue with an intergovernmental review with people who refuse to listen to you, who refuse to accept any of the arguments you put, and whose aim is to remove your powers? So I think this is an immensely serious threat to everything that we've been doing, and it's utterly unnecessary. But yes, I mean, frameworks, we put a huge amount of effort into frameworks. And the Welsh Government, I'd say, feels it even more strongly than we do, that this is being thrown away, completely thrown away. because of a desire by one or two people in the UK government to do down devolution and to try and make sure that they can get the type of trade deals they want. It is shocking and it is tragic.
Cabinet Secretary, can I thank you and your officials for giving us evidence this morning. I'm now going to suspend the committee for about 5 minutes to ensure our next panel of witnesses are ready, and I'll put in the chat bar ready when we're about to recommence. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you.
Our next evidence session is our first pre-budget scrutiny evidence, which is focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on the public finances. Today we'll hear from the Scottish Fiscal Commission on its fiscal update published last week. And I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome our new Fiscal Matters Advisor, David Phillips, and thank him for his very helpful briefing paper. I'd also like to put on record our thanks to David Eisner for all his hard work as our previous advisor. I now welcome our witnesses to the meeting, Dame Susan Rice, who's the chair of the SFG, Professor Alistair Smith, the Commissioner, and Claire Murdoch, who's the head of Social Security and Public Funding at the SFC. Before we move to questions from the committee, I'm going to invite Dame Susan to make some short opening remarks, but can I remind members to direct their initial questions at least to Susan Rice, who will field these questions. So Dame Susan, would you like to make a short opening remark?
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Good morning. Is it still morning? Yes. And thank you for asking us to give evidence today. I shall start with a few publications we released in the last week and a half, but don't worry. In the words of Henry VIII to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. There'll be time for questions. So first, our fiscal update report. As you'll be well aware, the coronavirus pandemic has had a profound effect on the fiscal and economic outlook in Scotland and the UK. In our second fiscal update last week, we set out the latest position of the Scottish budget. We discussed the potential variations in the budget which the government will have to manage this year, and we consider the effects of COVID-19 on the economy. I'll say something briefly about each of these three areas. The Scottish budget has increased by £3 billion since the Scottish Government presented its summer budget revision in May. It now includes a £6.5 billion of guaranteed funding from the UK Government for spending related to COVID-19. This funding largely addresses one of the concerns we raised in our last fiscal update in April. We highlighted then that uncertainty about the level of funding from the UK Government could make it difficult for the Scottish Government to balance its budget. While this guarantee, along with the fixed funding for income tax for the year, do provide greater certainty, there are still some areas of the budget where the government continues to have uncertainty. LBTT, as well as landfill tax revenues, along with devolved social security spending, vary in year, although we expect variations largely to be offset by changes in the block grant adjustments. We don't know what those will be yet, but when we get to the Scottish budget, likely in December, we'll have updated forecasts of Scottish revenues and spending and updated forecasts from the OBR to inform the BGAs. At that point, we'll have a clearer picture of the Scottish budget. Our report also sets out our initial expectations for the Scottish economy. The latest data suggests the economy shrank by nearly a quarter between February and April. Since then, we've seen a gradual resumption of economic activity, and we expect GDP to rise rapidly as economic activity resumes more fully. However, we anticipate GDP will remain below its pre-crisis level until 2023. And that's because over this period, unemployment is likely to be elevated and earnings will be lower for many people. We expect some permanent damage to the Scottish economy. It's probably fair to say the economic and fiscal effects of this crisis will be felt for years to come. Our report highlights the large increase in UK government borrowing to fund the UK-wide response to the crisis. We note how, at some point, this will need to be repaid, and that will potentially affect the Scottish budget as well. Our report also noted that next year, the Scottish Government will need to manage the income tax reconciliation that relates to 2018-19. The relevant outturn data will be published in a fortnight on the 23rd of this month, and we will publish an evaluation of those data on the 5th of October. So enough on our fiscal update. I turn now to our annual forecast evaluation report for 2019-20, which mainly covers the period before the impact of COVID-19. While there's individual variability, taken collectively, our forecasts of devolved tax revenues and of Social Security spending were within 2% of the outturn, In the world of forecasting, that's pretty good, though I think the technical way of saying so is that this outcome would be considered reasonable. However, we know that COVID-19 will significantly alter the world, and the forecast errors for the current financial year are likely to be greater. The third publication is our Statement of Data Needs, which sets out the areas where we believe improved information would support our work. Relevant to the fiscal update I just spoke about, we highlight how our work on the Scottish budget has developed, and we describe a variety of ways it would be improved through better or timelier provision of data or information. Alongside these three publications, in the last 10 days, we also published 2 policy costings to accompany Scottish Government legislation relating to Social Security. The first was for the new child winter heating assistance, and the second for the new Scottish child payment. And our forecast of this takes account of the large increases we've seen in universal credit claims since March. So with that, I'll hand back over to you, convener, for the question and answer session.
Thank you, Dame Susan. Thank you, Dame Susan. If I may, I'm going to start off the session. Obviously, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are going to be risks to the Scottish budget. And I'm interested what the differential effect might be on Scotland, both in terms of the impact on the Scottish economy relative to the rest of the United Kingdom, as well as public expenditure, including devolved social security benefits relative to the rest of the United Kingdom, because as we all know, obviously, the fiscal framework is very much on the issue of relativity. So I just wonder, what consideration that the Fiscal Commission has given to any potential differential effect and what that might mean.
I might turn to my colleagues to augment our response to your question. It's a good question. One of the things that we've done initially in looking at the economic impact is to look at the change to our economic activity and to GDP as compared to what's happening across the UK. And in fact, so far, what we've seen is that our changes have roughly been in parallel to what we see in the rest of the country. That doesn't mean it will continue forever or not, but we haven't seen a big divergence. Obviously, lockdown has been handled in some respects differently in Scotland from England. In fact, the 4 nations are, making differences in how they respond to lockdown. In Scotland, the cessation of work in the construction sector was sort of bigger and longer than elsewhere. So we may also see timing differences in terms of recovery because those activities have to come on board and work has to begin to have an impact. So those are a couple of areas where we have considered what the differences might be. If I could perhaps turn to Alistair, would you like to augment my comments? Or Claire?
Yes, Susan, I'm happy to come in. I don't have much to add. As you say, where we've looked at the differential effects, they haven't turned out to be significant so far. But we have recognised that this is a risk and something that we will need to keep a close eye on, given the limited powers that the Scottish Government has to borrow to meet particular needs, should they differ from the needs that are funded through what's going on in UK government funding.
Claire, do you want to say anything?
Yes, thank you. I can just add on the fiscal side of things. So you're exactly right that it depends about the relative performance of Scotland and the rest of the UK in terms of the effect on the Scottish budget. We're still pretty early in this period in terms of the data that we have on tax and social security. I'll turn to tax first. We have so the taxes which affect the budget this year is LBTT and SLFT, the ones which have the direct effect in year. On LBTT, we have some evidence that transactions in Scotland took slightly longer to return to higher levels. than they did in England because the housing market took slightly longer. In terms of what that means for tax revenues over the year, we'll need to see how that plays out. It's still pretty early, and a month's difference in the opening of the housing markets might not make a huge difference over the whole year. In terms of social security, the largest benefits are administered by DWP and are on pretty much the same rules as the UK government ones. So changes which are happening there, we would expect to be broadly similar in Scotland and the rest of the UK. It's on the smaller benefits which are administered by Social Security Scotland where we might expect there to be a differential impact. And those are benefits that don't have block grant adjustments. So, for example, the Best Start grant is paid to families on low income benefits. In receipt of universal credit, for example, and what we expect to see, but we haven't got the data yet, is that as we have a higher number of families in Scotland receiving universal credit, more people will be paid that benefit. But it's still quite early to see that in the data. By the time we get to our next forecast, we will have more information about this. We'll update our forecast, the OBR will update theirs, and we'll have a better picture of what's happening in both the UK, the rest of the UK and in Scotland, and what the effect is on the Scottish budget. But you're absolutely right, it's about that relative performance which will affect the Scottish budget.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask one final question before we go to Murdo Fraser? I've got some concerns around the issue of the £6.5 billion guarantee. Not the actual amount itself, but how, as a Parliament, and how the Scottish Fiscal Commission, indeed, will be able to scrutinise exactly what's going on there, because in particular, any additional funding for England will not generate any additional funding for the Scottish Government until the Barnett formula implies that the total amount received should be greater than £6.5 billion. Now, according to our advisor, that implies that just over £8 billion can be announced in England before the Barnett formula applied to Scotland to receive, before the Barnett formula applies to the Scottish Government receiving more than the 6.5 million funding guarantee. So there's potential for lots of announcements, creating confusion, because the UK Government is announcing new money that might not actually apply to Scotland until that figure of £8 billion of new money has been reached, in which case we'll be over the 6.5 billion mark in Scotland. So how are the Scottish Fiscal Commission going to go about scrutinising that, and how much comes into the Scottish budget or otherwise, and what advice would you give to the committee?
Thank you for quite a challenging question. I would perhaps just remind everyone that the offer of guaranteed funding in relation to actions around the pandemic was a request and came out of discussion between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. The Scottish Government, as we all know, has to have a balanced budget, and having complete uncertainty around all of this extra funding was just, beyond anything that was reasonable. And so the guaranteed funding was welcomed. The understanding is that if less were spent by the UK government, the Scottish Government would not have to reduce that 6.5 billion, but if more was spent by the UK government, that more would come to Scotland. In terms of the timing of that, that is a matter for, it's a political matter. It's not something that we could speak to. What matters with the Scottish government hat on is it's the budget for each year. So even if, so I know you asked about scrutinizing, but I think it's helpful to understand the framework around this. If the British government said it was spending a lot more and some more would go to Scotland, but it was towards the end of this year and that came next year, that might cause some issues as well. So it's a matter of understanding the mechanism here as well as the actual amounts. Claire, could I ask you, I don't want to lean on you too much, but I think you have quite a keen understanding of this space.
Yes, thank you, Susan. Just to add to that, obviously the amount that Treasury have guaranteed the Scottish Government so far will not go down, but obviously if the UK government make further announcements, the Scottish government will receive extra funding. And you're absolutely right that there will be a point where if the announcements continue to be made, there will be sort of no new funding coming out of that. And then after a certain point, there will obviously be more funding coming to the Scottish government. Potentially this can happen quite late in the financial year as well. So when the supplementary estimates are presented to the UK Parliament, normally in February, at that point there could be revisions to this figure, and that's quite late in the financial year for the Scottish Government to deal with. And essentially that was why I think the UK Government made this offer to guarantee the funding, was to provide a minimum level of certainty. But if there are further announcements or higher spending in England, then obviously the Scottish Government may receive extra funding quite late in the financial year, and then they either, if they can't spend it in the financial year, they can put it in the reserve and manage it in that way.
Okay, thank you. Murdo.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Dame Susan and colleagues. Can I just start by picking up that last point, 6.5 billion? Is it not just the point of this that this gives the Scottish Government some certainty in terms of budget planning, that they're not relying upon rolling announcements of Barnett consequentials, but in terms of this financial year, they know what the overall envelope is going to be, and that's not going to go down. It could, but it's not going to go down. Is that not the key issue here?
Yes, the £6.5 billion that have been given to the Scottish Government will not go down. I'd also point out that certainty comes from having fixed revenues or fixed expenditure. And so in addition to knowing that £6.5 billion is available, income tax is fixed. It's a fixed number for the budget year. Obviously, it becomes reconciled a couple of years later, but for the year, that is quite a lot, a big chunk of the Scottish budget that is also fixed. There are variables, because they're variables where funding moves within year, as in housing transactions. The revenue from LBTT comes at the point of each transaction. So it's sporadic and periodic, if you will. Social Security expenditure is also something that happens in year and can change in year, although since the payments are monthly, it's a little more certain. So the Scottish Government is not relieved of all uncertainty, but the combination of the 6.5 billion certain and income tax certain, which is nearly double that amount, does give the government a fair amount to work with.
Sorry, Murdo, just for absolute clarity. Just for absolute clarity, before we go off that point, I welcome the guarantee. It's a good thing to have, but currently the maximum Barnett room that the Scottish Government's got is 5.7 million. We will not necessarily reach that guarantee amount. It's just there if we need it. I think I want to just make sure that's on the record, because in case that becomes unclear. Am I right in that, Susan?
I believe you are, but you can speak perhaps for the Parliament and government, whereas the Fiscal Commission can't tell you exactly what you've spent. But my understanding is the 6.5 billion has not all been allocated, if you will, yet.
Okay, sorry, Murdo. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. I've just got a couple more questions, just following on from the convener's original line of questioning around differential impacts. One of the things we know is that levels of public spending per capita in Scotland are much higher than the UK average, and therefore the public sector is a larger part of the Scottish economy compared to the UK as a whole. And I wonder if that is factored into your assessments of any likely differential impact on Scotland from COVID and the economic consequences of that.
Again, a good question to ask. So if we look at, for instance, Social Security, so I'm looking at the devolved areas that we deal with. If you look at Social Security spending, some of the benefits that have gone live, if you will, and most of them have now under the Scottish Government jurisdiction, Some of those have been changed in specific terms, in terms of eligibility, in terms of ease of applying. The child payment is a new payment, so the Scottish Government is making available more under that Social Security heading to its population. So that it's correct to say that we're aware of that. The government's job, because it has to have a balanced budget, is to know what it's spending and to balance the budget. So if, we've said this in past sessions with this committee at times, if it needs or wants to spend more in one area, it may have to spend a little less somewhere else. So I don't know if that absolutely answers your question, but we're certainly aware of some of those differences, and we consider those in looking at what we do.
Okay, thank you. And just one more question, and it's picking up something that's in your fiscal update paper, and it's around the prospects for what's called rather dramatically a Scotland-specific economic shock. And you do make some comments around pages 15 to 17 around the prospects for that. And you say it is the likelihood of that being triggered is greater than in a typical year. Now, of course, what that would do is trigger additional borrowing powers to the Scottish Government, which I'm sure they would welcome. But do you have any sense on the likelihood of us getting into that territory?
I can turn to either of my colleagues, but my first response is we have not forecast or predicted the likelihood of getting there. It's just that we are in extraordinary times this year, and that leads us to believe that we don't, we just don't know. We don't know how the rest of the year will play out in terms of the pandemic. I mean, nobody knows that at this stage. And so it's possible that this, Scottish-specific shock might happen, but so far we haven't seen indices that are saying we're on the verge of it. Alistair, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, there are two conditions to trigger a Scottish-specific economic shock. One is that the growth of Scottish GDP should be less than 1%, and clearly that condition, sadly, is going to be met by a long way. There's going to be negative growth this year. But the second condition is that growth in Scotland should be more than 1% less than growth in the UK. Now, what we've seen so far is that growth in the UK has fallen by about 25% in the first quarter of the financial year, and in Scotland by approximately the same. And when you're looking at big numbers like that, you don't need much divergence to get a 1% difference between them. But as you said, Susan, so far there hasn't been that 1% divergence, but it's easy to imagine that relatively small differences between the performance of the Scottish and UK economies could trigger a Scottish-specific economic shock. But it would clearly be unwise of the Scottish Government to assume that the Scottish-specific economic shock is going to be triggered and that they will get access to the additional £300 million of borrowing. We just don't know at this stage.
Thank you.
Okay, Murdo, thank you. George Adam, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Dame Susan. I'd just like to follow on from what you said just there about the extraordinary times that we live in, and the fact that, with COVID-19, the situation we have with the Scottish Government, where, effectively the Scottish Government is funded in such a way that it's always retrospectively they receive the money, so there's less flexibility there with the Barnett formula and other promises as well. But I've just noted that in your actual submission, in page 4, section 13, you've got pre-COVID-19 crisis, the Scottish budget had already increased in size and complexity. Then you go on to talk about the government's responsibilities, the Scottish Government's responsibilities, some of which are the social security commitments and things like that as well. Now, the great philosopher in the 60s, Stanley, wrote, "With great power comes great responsibility." But the Scottish Government, we appear to have all the responsibility, but very little of the powers to actually make the difference we need. My question would be, is there a better way? Is there a way that we could actually get so the government could be more flexible? We talked about borrowing powers for the Scottish Government just previously. Is that the way forward, or is there a better way for the Scottish Government to be able to actually act in such a way that when we're dealing with this incredible crisis, this worldwide pandemic, where they can actually deal with everything themselves? Because at this time, I'm just looking for some form of solution so that we can actually deliver for the people of Scotland.
So I very much appreciate the sentiment behind your question, and I'd answer it in several different ways, I suppose. First of all, to some extent, the question you're asking would have to receive a response on the political side, not from an independent fiscal body. We couldn't say there's a better way to borrow or interact between the two governments. There is power, and there is, to some extent, within Scotland, because the devolved powers give Scotland the ability to collect, for some taxes, revenues in year and keep those going, and also to decide how it wants to expend on a number of social security programs and benefits. And there is power and the ability to make decisions in that field. In terms of the extraordinary times of COVID, even if both governments were to decide they wanted to have a conversation about shifting the way things were working, my own personal view is this is not the moment to start making fundamental changes in the way we do things. We all of us in our nations and collectively across the UK have to get through this period as well as we can. The guaranteed funding, which was one of the requests made by the Scottish Government to the UK Government, was granted, and that, I think, has helped quite a bit. I don't know if either of my colleagues wants to add anything to that.
Alistair Smith wanted to come in, Susan.
Yes, I think that the COVID experience is an interesting test of devolution powers, because for perfectly understandable economic reasons endorsed by the OBR, the UK government's COVID response has largely been funded by borrowing, which is a reserved power at the UK government level. So one of the questions that ought to be asked in the near future is, looking back over this experience, has a response to COVID that has largely been funded by UK borrowing been sufficiently responsive to the needs of Scotland? And as Susan said, our feeling in the Commission is that the time to look at that is when the fiscal framework comes up for review. It will be, at that point, very interesting to look back at the COVID experience and say, was it the case that the needs of Scotland and the needs of the rest of the UK were so similar? The Scottish Government's desired policy response was sufficiently close to the UK government's desired policy response, that the fiscal framework worked well, or alternatively, the fiscal framework didn't give the Scottish Government enough control over its own response to the COVID pandemic. These are questions for the governments to consider when they review the fiscal framework in 21-22.
Thank you, Professor Smith. That's extremely interesting. I'll keep that in mind as we move forward. But Dame Susan, in no way am I trying to get you involved in a political rammy. I'm just trying to find a practical way of trying to get delivery out there for the people of Scotland. And, even within your own paper, again, in page 4, section 16, you've got the Scottish Government's borrowing powers were not designed to manage fiscal stabilisation, which is the responsibility of the UK government, who borrow on behalf of the UK and either allocate spending for reserved areas or transfer proportional funding to the Scottish Government for devolved areas. The Scottish Government is not able to borrow to fund proportionally greater spending on its COVID-19 response than the rest of the UK. Now, my argument would be, having read that, would be, is that not part of the problem? Is that not part of the issue we have? Because, we constantly hear about political bickering between governments and things like that. But if there was actually a meeting of, there was the powers there, we would be able to actually deal with the issue ourselves and deal with that properly. It just seems to me that we still seem to have most of the responsibility, yet none of the powers.
So I'm not sure how to give you a different response to that. I understand your concern and why you're asking the question in that way, but it's not in our capability to give you an answer to that. And quite honestly, to get a good answer to the question you're raising, I would say again that what I said and what Alistair said, trying to analyze that and come up with a solution in the middle of a crisis is, to my mind, not the right way to do it, because you really do need to see the denouement. You need to see how things play out and then look back, not all the way in the future, but look back soon, and you can come up with much better view of what has worked and what hasn't worked. So that's really the best response I can give you, but it's a personal view, actually, about when one goes into, pull up the paving stones fully and look what's underneath. I don't know, Claire, if you would have anything else to maybe a more specific response to give than I have.
I think the only thing I can add is that the work that we're doing looking at the Scottish budget and how it's funded is explaining and trying to add transparency to how the budget works under the current arrangements. I think it's for others to talk about whether the current arrangements are suitable or should be changed. Our focus is very much on trying to improve people's understanding of this, because it's not super easy to understand how the Scottish Government's funded. It's not a simple process, especially as you add in all the new tax and social security devolution, which has, as we highlight in the report, further added complexity to the Scottish budget. So that's our intention, which may not address the question you're asking, I'm afraid, but hopefully we can explain where we're coming from.
My final question would be, the frustration I feel and others feel is the fact that we are living in extraordinary times, and this is effectively it's a worldwide pandemic. It's a health situation. People are dying at this situation, and I can understand, coming from your point of view, where you say we need to look at it at a later date to get all the facts and figures together. But for me, the concern is, how are we dealing with it in the here and now? How can we actually deal with this? Because this is life and death. This isn't just an academic study. This is something we need to deal with the here and now.
So there are kind of two strands, I think, coming out of your comment there. One of them is the health strand, that this is a pandemic. It's a matter of health. It's global. It's around the globe. And I would just say that ultimately, I believe that science will get us there, and that we will have the mechanisms, super fast, easy, cheap testing, vaccinations, and so forth to see us out. We're in a tunnel, but we will come out of the tunnel at some point. The other strand to what you're asking is the impact that has on the economic factors just now. Yep. And my understanding is, again, I can't comment politically, but that businesses have benefited. Many have benefited from the broad schemes, the furlough scheme as it's known, and the small business loan guarantee scheme. The Scottish Government has offered more recently some support to the arts and culture sector, which sometimes people think, oh, that's to the side, but that is actually critically essential to thriving cities in Scotland. So the Scottish Government has, I think, found places where it can focus and create some of its own programs as well. I don't know what else we could say to you with the limitations of our remit, the constraints of our remit, that would take the conversation further. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
Alistair Smith, I think he's indicated he'd like to say something as well, George, and then I'm going on to Jackie Bailey.
That of course, when we're talking about issues of life and death, health responsibilities are devolved, and the Scottish Government has had the responsibility for many aspects of its response in Scotland to the COVID pandemic, lockdown policies, and so on. The question is, I think, the question for the Fiscal Commission, and maybe the issue behind your question, Mr. Adam, is whether the Scottish Government gets adequate funding to support its devolved responsibilities. And as Susan said in the introduction, so far the indications are that the funding available has matched in a reasonable way the Scottish Government's programmes, but that's something that can be reviewed at the end of the year when we'll have a better overall picture.
Thank you, Alistair. Jackie Bailey, please.
You, Dame Susan, and to your colleagues as well. I think there's no doubt we're heading for a position where it's likely that we will see falling taxes and increasing spending. But I specifically want to focus on social security with you, because I'm very conscious that the reconciliations for social security are in year, and therefore there's an immediate impact on the budget. I understand disability benefits account for the main element of social security spending. I'm kind of wondering, could you give us an order of magnitude for that? But can you also comment on what you expect might happen as a consequence of the coronavirus restrictions? Do you think the budget will go up? And if so, by how much, I think, is the million-dollar question.
So if we all knew the answers to all questions like that, Jackie, we'd be in a different place. I would say that in my opening comments, I talked about the small response we made to costings recently. We have factored in, compared to March, the increase in uptake of universal credit. So that is a trigger for some social security benefits. And there has been, as we know, an increase right around the UK and certainly in Scotland to that uptake. So that would lead potentially to greater eligibility for some of the specific benefits or social security programs. I'm going to turn to Claire, because her remit as one of our most senior people in the Commission is on the sort of public policy side, but also on social security, and she knows that area inside out. Claire, perhaps you can give a more specific response to Jackie.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. So in our report, we talk about a number of the ways that we think social security spending could be affected. So you're absolutely right. Disability benefits account for the bulk of the £3.5 billion of devolved social security. And the main change that we think is going to happen there is that DWP have made a number of changes to how they administer the benefits. So they've suspended face-to-face assessments, given the COVID crisis. They've also paused some reviews. They've made other changes to sort of the administration. And those changes we think will potentially lead to some increases in spending. And that would be in Scotland and the rest of the UK. There's also changes. We don't know fully what the effect of COVID is going to be on people's health. You could potentially see increases in the demand for these benefits if people's health is affected. And we also know that sadly the majority of people that have died from this virus have been older people who are more likely to be in receipt of attendance allowance. So there may be an effect there that potentially reduces spending as well. We will take all of these factors into account when we produce our next forecast in December. Most of these effects we will see across the rest of the UK as well. So when the OBR produce their updated forecasts, we'll get an update of the block grant adjustment position, which we think should largely offset that. This is obviously the majority of spending, which is administered by DWP at the moment. There's also the benefits which are administered in Scotland, and there's several changes which we will factor into our forecast then. So the first one is obviously universal credit applications increased a lot, and we think that that will push up spending on the low-income means-tested benefits which are administered by Social Security Scotland. Yesterday we published a costing of the new Scottish Child Payment, which the Scottish Government originally planned to launch before Christmas, but will now make the first payments from February. And in producing that forecast, we took account of the increase in universal credit claims, which pushes up spending across our whole forecast horizon. And we also make an assumption that we think take-up will increase as well, because we think more people are now aware of the support which is available to them. So all of these factors will affect spending. I think the majority will probably push spending up slightly. Some may also dampen spending. And it's still very early for us to do a forecast at this point in time. We're just making sort of comments at the moment about what we think the effect will be. And at the time of the Scottish budget, we'll have a much better estimate of the position in year for the Scottish Government, but also what the forecasts look like across the next 5 years. So I think that's also an important point, that we'll know how spending is going to evolve over that period of time. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, Convener. That's very helpful. I'm very conscious that we were coming up from an autumn budget revision, and I'm sure the majority of this quite clearly isn't going to be reflected in that. Is going to be towards the end of the year. But I'm kind of concerned that as the job retention scheme starts to unwind, we're going to see massive spikes in unemployment. And therefore the consequent impact on, a range of devolved benefits, everything from the Best Start grant that was referenced earlier by Claire Murdoch, and also, council tax reduction statistics for which were published yesterday. So it's too early then to get an order of magnitude from you, and I need to wait till December, is what you're saying?
Yes, I'm afraid so. But in December, we should have a much better. Well, we'll have to make forecasts, even if we don't have much more information. But we will be able to present you with what we think is a better picture than we would be at the current point in time.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Jackie. Can I now go to Dean Lockhart, please?
Thank you very much, Convener. I would like to ask the SFC about the fiscal trends highlighted in the most recent GERS figures, which show a gap between revenue and expenditure in Scotland of over £15 billion, which was an increase of £2 billion from the previous year. On the expenditure side, the GERS figures reflect only a few weeks of the additional expenditure coming from the UK government on the COVID response, so this may be part of the reason for the increasing deficit. But I would like to ask, are there other reasons on the revenue side to explain the increasing deficit? For example, are we seeing a decline in the income tax base in Scotland, or revenues from the income tax base? And are we seeing less revenues being generated from other devolved tax?
So if I could begin the response by just reminding everybody that the GERS covers or takes a snapshot of or estimates the value of all public spending and all public revenue in and on behalf of Scotland, and that covers local government, the Scottish government, and the UK government. So it goes well the devolved envelope of devolved taxes and benefits. So it would include UK-wide public spending on defence, for instance. It would include the expenditure of local government, where different decisions may be made in different bodies around the UK. So I just wanted to remind everybody about that. When you talk about the differential, I'm not sure with the numbers you use whether you're referring to overall GERS values or referring simply to the part of that bigger picture which relates to devolved taxes and benefits.
Yes, I'm looking at the role of the revenue generated from devolved taxes in the overall component of the deficit. I very much appreciate the SFC doesn't look at, for example, UK government spending in Scotland, but I'm looking at the role of the revenue arising from devolved taxes in that overall increasing fiscal gap.
Okay, no, thank you for the clarification. Alistair, I think you're probably ready with the response, so why don't I turn to you?
Well, the most important devolved tax is income tax, accounting for about £11 billion of annual revenue to the Scottish Government. And that's the area where, therefore, one might have the largest concern about whether the Scottish, whether the amount of tax that was being raised within Scotland was falling behind the UK. We will, as you said in your opening remarks, Susan, get an update on the 2018-19 outturn later this month on the 23rd. And we'll be producing a report at the beginning of October. And I think some of our colleagues are then going to appear before the committee. And it's after that update is available is the time to, well, we will be looking more closely at the question of how the income tax base in Scotland is or is not diverging from the UK tax base. And we'll be in a position then to answer your question more fully, Mr. Lockhart.
Thank you for that response. Perhaps in anticipation of next month's outturn figures, you could provide a summary of the main trends we've seen from previous outturn figures in terms of, I guess, the overestimation in some respects of the number of Scottish taxpayers at different bands. Perhaps you could give us a highlight of those trends and what the impact of that overestimation has been on Scotland's public finances.
Alistair, I'll just come back directly to you on that because I see you put an arrow in.
Well, I think we had a discussion about this the last time we appeared before this committee, and the committee produced a very interesting paper on it. There is some evidence that the expected divergence in 2018-19 is as a result of unexpectedly rapid growth of the tax base among the highest taxpayers in the rest of the UK, which frankly probably means among the highest taxpayers in London and the South East. And that will certainly be an issue that we and you will want to look at more closely when we have the 2018-19 figures and the 2021, the 21-22 reconciliation later this month. That's one. That is the headline question, I think. To what extent have income distribution changes led to these these divergences in income tax? It's probably an issue that we will not be able to answer fully in October, but we'll do some initial work on and probably all want to come back to later.
That's very helpful, thank you. And I guess just my final supplemental question on that, are you seeing anecdotally or otherwise what impact COVID might have on behavioural change or that mobility or movement of the higher rate taxpayers within the UK market?
I think I'm correct. Sorry, Alistair, go ahead if you want.
I was going to say, I think we have.
Alistair, on you go.
Sorry to cut across you, Susan. At this point, we simply don't know enough about that. Clearly, there is evidence that people with higher incomes have done better during the COVID crisis than lower income people because their jobs have been more secure, more opportunities for working from home, and therefore less exposed to the risk of unemployment. But when we're looking at what might have happened to the rest of the UK tax base, we're talking about what has happened right up at the very top of the income distribution, and we simply don't know. Certainly, I shouldn't say we don't know. I certainly don't know anything about how the COVID crisis has affected the very highest earners in the UK. That information is not available now, and it's not going to be available next month either.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anything else, Susan?
No, Alistair said what I was going to say, probably much more eloquently.
Right, okay, I'll go to Alexander Burnett then, thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and just note members to my register of interest. Now, if we can start by looking at one of the many levers that are under the Scottish Government control, namely LBTT, this accounts for the majority of a shortfall of the devolved taxes, but in the introduction, you point out that the majority of this shortfall cannot be attributed to COVID. So can I just ask what the fundamental reasons you think are that this tax is not raising as much as it should be?
So, Claire, can I turn to you? I mean, it's a lot of variability in our forecast in the last couple of years. We overpredicted LBTT revenues by about 3%, mainly because we overestimated how many transactions would be in the top two bands, and that is where the largest amount comes in receivables, and it's not just the overall number of transactions; it's where they fall in the different bands of LBTT. But Claire, would you give a more specific response, please?
Thank you, Susan. So you've just highlighted there we had a forecast error on residential transactions. I should say this is not us saying that revenues should have raised this. This is saying compared to what we thought they were going to raise, this is how much revenue they raised. Residential LBTT revenues we over-predicted by 3%, which was £9 million. But actually the largest forecast error that we had was on the non-residential side. And the reason there really is that non-residential revenues are highly concentrated in very high value transactions. And if you have slightly fewer of these very high value transactions than you thought, then you raise quite a lot less revenue. So you don't have to get it very wrong to end up with a sort of revenue forecast error that's slightly larger. And so the real reason there was we forecast there were going to be 550 transactions worth more than £2 million that would take place in the last financial year. In actual fact, there were 506 transactions, and that accounts for a big chunk of that forecast error. And obviously, we take account of this when we produce our next set of forecasts, although what happened last year will obviously not be a perfect predictor of what's going to happen this year or next year, given we've had quite a big crisis that's happened since then. So hopefully that answers your question. The majority of this forecast error is just slightly fewer transactions right at the top taking place.
Yeah. Thank you. It very much shows the sensitivity in certain bands can have a major impact. Can I just ask you to confirm if I'm reading paragraph 321 correct? It says you've underestimated the number of transactions, and therefore your forecast would have been higher. Are you actually therefore saying the shortfall would also is higher? And therefore, the points you've actually made is actually worse than what the figures show.
I'll need to find the exact figures, but I think on the residential side, we underestimated the number of transactions, but we slightly overestimated our price assumption. So prices weren't quite as high as we thought. So when you take those two things into account, that's those sort of forecast errors slightly offset themselves on the residential side.
Okay, thank you. And just going forward, the OBR. It hasn't formally updated its forecast, but it has produced updated scenarios, optimistic, central and pessimistic, for tax revenues and spending, which then go on to inform its other costings. Can I ask why you haven't produced any fiscal scenarios along the lines of the OBR? Is it a resource issue, or is there any other reason? And if you, maybe if you had, or do you have any expectation that with LBTT, that the higher transaction volumes might catch up towards the end of the year?
I think Susan's going to answer that first. Sorry, Susan.
Sorry. Bruce, tell us who should answer.
Okay, listen, Claire was on the ball there, so just let her keep going, and then if you want to come back in, Susan, let me know. Claire.
Okay, thank you. So you're asking why we haven't produced updated scenarios. So we set out what we think is happening broadly in the Scottish economy, giving that context. In terms of the Scottish budget, what really matters for the budget position is not just about what we think is happening to Scottish tax revenues, but it's about what's happening to Scottish tax revenues relative to the rest of the UK. And the scenarios the OBR have produced are very helpful in giving that kind of broad indication of what's going to happen, but that they haven't produced forecasts which can be used to calculate the block grant adjustments. So if we produced a forecast that said, say, LBTT revenues are going to fall, and then sort of present that in the Scottish budget, it would make the position look pretty bad. But obviously, once the updated block grant adjustment figures are known, you'll have both of those figures together, so you know the funding position and you know the revenue position, and at that point in time we'll have a much better estimate of what's happening to the Scottish budget. So we'll be doing that alongside the Scottish budget, which is now expected to be in December. I don't know if Susan or Alistair want to add anything to that.
I would simply say that the OBR have done their scenarios. I believe the Fraser of Allender have done scenarios. There are other scenarios out there. So in terms of informing thinking more generally, there is that's available.
Thank you. Thank you. And just finally, to Dame Susan, you mentioned in the data needs paper the issue over transparency with the Scottish Government making information public, which unfortunately seems to be a bit of a reoccurring theme at the moment. Can I just ask, are you making any progress on this matter?
Well, I think overall, overall in the report, we noted that there has been a lot of progress, and we believe that we have a very good dialogue with the Scottish Government about data needs. And these have improved over time. So we're simply adding each year to what would be even more helpful. Obviously, data, we try in our forecast, because of our commitment to transparency and to being able to have anyone who looks at our work understand what lies underneath it. We want to use public data to the fullest extent possible. Sometimes governments, this one or other ones, want to hold back data because they're not certain about its, either waiting to check it or when it comes in or for whatever reason, and will ultimately make it public. It's just we have a timetable. So we're really looking at how to just match our needs for our analysis with the government's needs for handling its data in some respects. Overall, there's been a movement towards progress here.
Thank you. That's all.
Right, Tom Arthur, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. For simplicity, I'll ask this question to Dame Susan. Appreciate she moves to delegate it to one of her colleagues. My first question concerns the sustainability of UK debt, and I raise that with reference to paragraph 21 of the Fiscal Update Report, which is in the summary. It makes reference to the possibility that the UK government may wish to rebalance its fiscal policy, potentially by increasing what would be devolved taxes, and that would have a knock-on impact in Scotland. I appreciate your remit is with regards to fiscal policy within Scotland, but given that intimate connection, I wonder if you're able to perhaps sketch out what an objective definition of sustainable debt would be, and whether or not the UK government's current position vis-à-vis its debt is sustainable, or would it necessitate intervention through the use of fiscal levers such as increasing income tax at a UK level?
A big question, and certainly the last part of the question, we wouldn't be in a position to comment on the sustainability of the UK's approach to it. I see that Alistair has put his virtual hand up, and I wonder if you want to respond more specifically.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. As you said, Susan, the Scottish Fiscal Commission has no responsibility for commenting on the fiscal sustainability of the UK government's policy, and it's at the UK level that fiscal sustainability arises as an issue, because, as we discussed earlier, borrowing is a reserved power to the UK government. But turning to what the OBR has said, it seems that the OBR is I wouldn't want to put words in their mouth, but my interpretation would be that they're relatively relaxed about the growth of UK government borrowing in the short run in the context of the COVID crisis and additional borrowing of 130, 150 billion pounds at a time that interest rates are very low seems to be something that the OBR is quite relaxed about. But everyone assumes that borrowing, it's right to assume that borrowing eventually has to be repaid, and it's quite right that when the UK government seeks to bring its borrowing back down, it will need to raise taxes or cut expenditures, and cutting expenditures in devolved areas or raising taxes in devolved areas will have direct impacts on the Scottish Government budget in the future. That's, if you like, the way that borrowing which is being done at the UK level by the UK Government, that's part of the way in which Scotland's share of that gets repaid in the long run through the impact on Scottish taxes and Scottish expenditure.
Thank you, Professor Smith. I wonder if I could just clarify, please correct me if I've misunderstood you, but if I understand you correctly, you suggested that it's ultimately going to be a binary choice or combination of public expenditure cuts or increases in taxation. I presume then you think, given the gravity of the economic crisis we're facing, there's no possibility of the UK's fiscal position becoming sustainable simply through economic growth. It will require, I'm asking this just as an objective question of economic analysis, that simply it's going to be beyond the realms of possibility for the UK as a whole for its economy to grow to such a level where revenues are generated which can bring public finances into a sustainable footing. It will need a fiscal intervention.
Well, it would be a very happy, well, not very happy future. It would certainly be an optimistic future if rates of economic growth in the future were high relative to rates of interest on the debt. To the extent that that's the case, one can be relaxed about the debt burden. But it's probably prudent to assume that when a government takes on a large amount of additional debt, as the UK government is doing in this year, it's prudent to assume that not all of that is going to be painlessly repaid as a result of economic growth. But I'm not disagreeing with the underlying assumption of your question. If we could be very optimistic about economic growth, we have to be less worried about the burden of future debt. That's absolutely right.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith. My second question is a process question that we often come back to in these exchanges in this committee with yourselves. The SFC obviously is a relatively young organisation, and particularly with the new social security spending coming online this year. We've acknowledged in previous exchanges that it may take a period of time before building up sufficient knowledge to help really hone in and make predictions as accurate as possible. With regard to the disruptive impact that COVID has had and the significant financial interventions that there have been, what impact does this have upon the robustness of your forecasts going forward 2 and 3 years? And do you think that will delay getting to a point where you would be confident that you'll be able to accrue that early learning to enhance the accuracy of your forecasts?
So, shall I start? Let me start by saying you described us as a relatively young organization, and yes, we are that, but young and finely formed, I would say, on behalf of the whole team in the organization. The SFC responded wisely and very quickly, actually back in January, sort of in February, seeing what was likely coming. And we equipped all of our teams to be able to work effectively and collegiately from their home bases. So we haven't sort of missed a beat. When you talked about process, there's something about having the capability and the equipment and all the rest of it to do our work, and we haven't missed a beat there. That's really important. In terms of accuracy of forecasts, a small reminder that forecasts are never right. As we know, we always try to get them closer and closer and understand each year why the outturn or the actuals varied from what we had forecast. But some of that is not only, and this gets back to a process question, not only relating to our work. We continue to refine our models. So that's an example of work that we've carried on over this period, as well as doing whatever else we do. That should help as the models mature and we understand things better, should help with accuracy. But you mentioned Social Security benefits specifically. As some of the newer ones come on, if you look at our accuracy in general, the benefits that came on first, we have forecast, in very good range. The ones that came on more recently, forecasts were not as good, sometimes because of the nature of the way they were introduced, sometimes because of the timing of when they were introduced, which may change, sometimes because of eligibility. So when we have a new benefit, and this would apply, I suppose, to a new tax at any point, that's coming online, there will always be greater uncertainty. And we all learn, those who collect and administer, as well as ourselves in terms of the analysis. Alistair, you want to add to that?
Yes, and first I'd like to add my compliments to yours, Susan, to the staff of the Fiscal Commission who have worked tremendously well over the last few months in these very changed circumstances. And on the substance of it, yes, forecasting is going to be difficult over the next year or so, because information about what's going on in the economy is coming in only gradually. They're very unusual circumstances. It's harder to speculate about how things might evolve over the next year or two. There are many more unknowns. But we will produce forecasts to accompany the Scottish Government budget, which we expect to be in December. We're limbering up to do that now. These forecasts will be subject to much greater uncertainties than our forecasts in the past. We will all be astonished if our forecast evaluation report of our 2021 forecasts turns out to be as good as our forecast evaluation report this year. And perhaps the most important thing to say, because as Claire has reminded us a couple of times, one of the big uncertainties of the Scottish Government budget is about differences between UK revenues and expenditure and Scottish revenues and expenditure, and the large parts of the budget are set on the basis of forecasts from us and the OBR. Both organisations will be doing their best in December to produce the most accurate forecasts possible, but with the best will in the world, divergences between our outturn and our forecast, and divergences between UK outturns and the OBR forecasts are going to be greater than normal. And that's one of the questions that will have to be considered, what we have learned about COVID and the fiscal framework, whether the fiscal framework makes enough provision for adjustments arising from forecast error in circumstances where, with the best will in the world, there are likely to be very much larger forecast errors than that have been in the past.
Could I just add, thank you for that, Alice, a footnote to this discussion. We were previously asked about data availability, and that also is, in a process sense, essential to our, the efficacy of our forecasting ability. You all know, I think, that we're part of an international OECD network of independent fiscal institutions, and Claire and I joined a virtual meeting a couple of months back, and the number of other countries which were saying during the pandemic, particularly early months, they just weren't able to get the data they would normally get at all. And the fiscal institutions there were saying this was a great worry. I think it's fair to say that we have done quite well in Scotland, and I think in the UK, I will look specifically at the bodies that give us data in Scotland. They've done a good job of keeping us pretty up to date through all of this, and that's very helpful as well.
Thank you very much. As much as I would like to continue this exchange, I'm conscious of time, so I'll conclude there, Convener.
Okay, just before I go to Alec Rowley, I want to continue that exchange because Alistair, you just said something pretty important, and I think we need to pick up on it, about COVID and the impact on the economy and the uncertainty and destabilising effect of it, and effectively the turbulence it's created. What you're signalling up to us is there's a significant danger point potentially coming around understandable forecast error, which is made because we just do not know what the COVID situation will throw up, and there's potential for significant divergence between what the OBR believe and the SFC believe. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but the potential is there. Does that not signal up to us a danger point in terms of the potential impact on the Scottish budget that we need to be very aware of? Alistair.
It's not so much a danger point for the Scottish budget immediately as the risk that the forecasts that go into the Scottish budget turn out to, and I'm sorry, there are inevitable difficulty with talking about two forecasts and two divergences from the forecast. I think the source of what you call turbulence, it wasn't my word, it arises not so much from the fact that the budget depends on our forecast and the OBR forecast, and if they diverge, then that has budget effects. But I think the bigger risk is that our forecast errors might diverge from the OBR's forecast errors when we see the outcome. And it turns out, even if our forecasts were quite close together, so that the budget position was set on relatively similar forecasts, if the Scottish outturn is different from our forecast in one direction and the UK outcome is different from the OBR's forecast in the other direction, then there would be reconciliations required, which might might be put strain on the Scottish Government's borrowing powers. I recognise
it's not an immediate danger point, but it's something we need to be aware of for future purposes. Okay, Alec Rowley, please.
I want to ask a question about capital, but before I do, can I go back to the point that Tom Arthur was making? I mean, you do point to the OBR Fiscal Sustainability Report of July this year, where you quote them saying it seems likely that there will need to raise tax revenues or reduce spending as a national share of a national income to put the public finances in a sustainable way. But are we clear there that would be a political choice, just as austerity was a political choice coming out of the last economic downturn, and that the options are there for government, that is simply one option? Are we sort of clear on that, yeah?
Sorry, were you directing that question to Claire, or did I miss, or just generally?
Yeah.
I think what you're suggesting is a great deal has been borrowed, because that's in the hands of the UK government to borrow for a crisis like this, and the assumption that at some point the borrowing needs to be reduced or paid back, whatever term one wants to put to it. There are choices in terms of how that happens, and I assume choices when that would happen. You asked if this was a political decision primarily. I think those choices would be political decisions.
Yeah, okay. So if I come back to, because some commentators have talked about the the post-war consensus and the Keynesian approach to driving the economy, and rather than trying to cut our way out of debt, we actually grow our way out of debt. So that was really what I was trying to refer to there. It was austerity is a political choice. But can I ask specifically about Scotland and the capital expenditure? Have you got any idea of the current position with regard to capital programmes and whether there is underspend and the scale of that underspend, if it is taking place? And you do say that the flexibility has been, and in fact the precedent is there previously where the Scottish governments have been able to borrow more in terms of capital, they've been able to exceed the capital limits. Is your view that that is a possibility for us looking forward if we took the political choice to grow the economy and grow our way to pay the debt back?
So 2 parts to your question. The first is, have things slowed down in terms of capital investment? And second, and it's a good question, can the use of the capital up in some way to help grow the economy? I don't have numbers to hand, and one of my colleagues may, and I suspect Claire will, but the fact that construction ceased, the fact that everything ceased, particularly in the early part of lockdown, means that projects will have slowed down. There's no question about that. I mean, a lot of them have started up again and so on and so forth, but there certainly was a very big hiccup at that point. But Claire, can I turn to you with perhaps you've got some more specific numbers to respond to the question?
Yes, thank you, Susan. So just in terms of the capital budget, so in our report we set out the level of funding the Scottish Government currently has for capital spending. We also highlight how the OBR in their report expect underspends this year across departments, particularly on capital. It is likely that the government will spend less, and I think the question is more for the Scottish Government when they present their autumn budget revision to Parliament in terms of whether they have an expectation of capital underspends this year. So we will obviously pick that up in our report in December alongside the Scottish budget when we know more about that. You also talked about capital borrowing. The Scottish Government can borrow £450 million a year for capital spending. They plan this year to borrow the maximum. We'll see whether that happens. And you also talk a bit about the flexibility. So in the past, Treasury has allowed the Scottish Government to draw down more from its capital reserve. And that was because they received very late negative consequentials from the UK government in the financial year. So Treasury allowed them to fund that gap by drawing down from the reserve. Obviously, they've used money in the reserve. If they have underspends this year, they can put it back into the reserve and they can use it in another financial year. So those options are available to the Scottish Government.
Okay, thank you, Jemina.
Okay, thank you very much, Alec. Can I thank our witnesses very much for their evidence today, Dame Susan Rice, Professor Alistair Smith and Claire Murdoch. That concludes our business for today, and I now close this meeting. Thank you, colleagues.